Hi, folks. Welcome to this week's edition of the Book of Mormon Digging Deeper version of Come Follow Me. I expect that any of you who might have read ahead to see what these sections are all about might be wondering, what is he going to talk about and how is he going to make this interesting today? But I have to tell you, I don't think I've ever learned so much while researching one episode as I have for this one. It's amazing what lies behind these otherwise pedestrian sections, if you will, when you dig deep enough. So today, we're going to be talking a lot about the Lamanites and the earliest missionary efforts of the young church. Please stick around and listen. I promise you it will be interesting. Today we're going to talk about sections 30 through 36. Section 30 was originally 3 different revelations, but they all were so short and so related as to content that the decision was made to combine them into one section. They were addressed in order to David Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., and John Whitmer, and they were received right after the September conference that we spoke of last week. This section 30 had to do with missionary work, as did section 31 addressed to Thomas B. Marsh, as also section 32 addressed to Parley P. Pratt and Ziba Peterson. In fact, all 7 sections were given to extend mission calls and contained instruction for the successful execution of those callings. So we're going to talk about all of them as one collective big section and focus on the message they all contained, which was missionary work among the Lamanites, and the effect that that had on the church and on the collective ire of the persecutors who tormented the church. And there's several important points I want to cover today, and I'm not quite sure where to start. I think one of the things that really jumped out at me during my research is that several of these men, in fact, all of these men, were new members of the church. I guess the exception would be Oliver Cowdery, who had been with Joseph since April of 1829 and who was the scribe who actually wrote the prophetically translated words onto paper. His mission call was actually extended in section 28. The Whitmer boys had also been around for a while, but even they had only been baptized since the middle of the year. So we're talking about 6 months at most after the formal organization of the church. In the case of Parley P. Pratt, he had only been baptized earlier in this same month of September by Oliver Cowdery. Now, as I said, Oliver Cowdery had already been called to serve among the Lamanites in the 28th section, and he was accompanied on this mission by Parley P. Pratt and Peter Whitmer Jr. Section 32 begins with, "And now concerning my servant Parley P. Pratt, behold, I say unto him that as I live, I will that he shall deliver my gospel and learn of me, and be meek and lowly of heart. And that which I have appointed unto him is that he shall go with my servants Oliver Cowdery and Peter Whitmer Jr. into the wilderness among the Lamanites." One might wonder, how could these young men go out on missions when they were just themselves recently baptized? And that's a fair question. But there's several things to consider. One was the message itself that they would convey to the world. It was actually a very simple message. The ancient gospel that the Lord had instituted upon the earth had been lost through apostasy and had been restored by the Lord himself in these latter days. As part of that restoration, he had provided a record written by the ancient inhabitants of the American continents, which contained the precious elements of his gospel that had been lost, and these were contained in a book called the Book of Mormon. You must remember that in the fall and winter of 1830, 1831, there was not a lot of depth of teaching and doctrines and practices that we exercise today. There was not an entire cultural structure to adapt to at that time. People were taught and often baptized on the very same day. And we're going to go over that. Great emphasis was placed on taking the message of the Book of Mormon to the Lamanites early on. In fact, this was the very first formal missionary work. This might seem odd to any historian of early American history, but there was an urgency to it, and it was all connected. Andrew Jackson was the president at the time. He was the one who signed the horrible bill called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which allowed him to exchange Indian lands in existing states along the eastern seaboard for lands west of the Mississippi River. While this act did not technically force the Indians to relocate, it was just as effective through coercion and threats. The most profound result of this terrible act was the removal of the Cherokees in 1838 and 1839 in what is now known as the Trail of Tears. But the awful work started immediately as the law was enacted, and the early missionaries were right smack in the middle of it. In the early 1800s, the white settlers hated the Indians and were jealous of their prior and long-standing claim to some of the most desirable lands the settlers had encountered. There was no reasonable way to obtain those lands from them, so growing pressure for Congress to force the issue resulted in the aforementioned Indian Removal Act. This was a very dark period of American history, and it turns out that it ran against the desires and the mandates of the young church that Joseph Smith and his followers were building. The church was determined to help and support and teach the native people, and this fact earned them the enmity of other settlers in surrounding areas. Their philosophical support for the plight of the American Indians was to be a great driver in the persecution and hatred that developed against the church. Coupled with that, their support of the anti-slavery sentiment that was stirring also contributed to that persecution. But the church was committed to elevating the dignity and hopes of all people, and they saw all people as part of the same human family. Every indication from the Book of Mormon was that its purpose was to transmit the history of those people to their descendants in the latter days. For example, we read from the title page, written by Moroni himself, these words: "Wherefore it is an abridgment of the record of the people of Nephi, and also of the Lamanites, written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel, and also to the Jew and Gentile." And we read this from the book of Enos, chapter 1, in which he says, "And I had faith, and I did cry unto God that he would preserve the records, and he covenanted with me that he would bring them forth unto the Lamanites in his own due time." And then there's this from Moroni, chapter 1. "Wherefore I write a few more things contrary to that which I had supposed, for I had supposed not to have written any more. But I write a few more things, that perhaps they may be of worth unto my brethren the Lamanites in some future day, according to the will of the Lord." Now, I guess this is the time to look into, but hopefully not go too far down the rabbit hole, on the issue of the Lamanites and just who they are. But before we do, let me say this. There are subjects that are clearly defined and taught in the scriptures and in the church, and then there are subjects that are not as yet fully explained by the Lord or by our leaders. The matter of just who are the Lamanites today and who are not is one of those subjects. Now that's because genetic studies by scientists seem to argue against a Middle Eastern origin for all but maybe a very few of the indigenous peoples, with many of them showing genetic traits more aligned with Mongolian and deep Asian roots. This was supposedly facilitated by a land bridge that existed between Asia and North America, when the oceans were significantly lower than they are today. The Bering Sea land bridge, by all accounts, was exposed before the great melting of the gigantic ice sheets that covered most of the northern hemisphere during the last ice age. With that melt at the end of the Younger Dryas period, the oceans rose 400 feet and covered all coastal settlements as well as that land bridge. The evidence for this is powerful, which raises other annoying questions, such as just how old is the record of human habitation? Does it extend back to the Ice Age 12,600 years ago or beyond? Well, this is definitely a question that is going to require an answer someday. But until then, it's going to have to require faith and forbearance on our part. I've made my peace with it, and I still have my strongly held testimony. The question does not bother me at all, but I realize that there are many for whom it is an issue. I know that when we cross the veil and see the world with clearer eyes, we will see how all of this worked out. But in the meantime, I still know that Adam and Eve were the progenitors of my race. This much I do know, that the Bible and the Book of Mormon are true. And because of that, I do know that there are answers to all of these questions. And with regard to the whole matter of the Lamanites and their descendants, or lack thereof, I too am fine with that question because I know the Book of Mormon is authentic, and it really was written by a man named Nephi, and Jacob, and Mosiah, and Alma, and the rest. And it is up to me to understand how and in what manner the Lord was referring to Lamanites. For the record, I do not mind raising some of these thorny questions because, as I have said so many times before, if the story is true, then there are answers. And the fact that we don't have all of them yet just simply means that we get to exercise faith in the things we cannot see. One question that some of you may want to know is, why did the church keep using the term Lamanite when it became obvious that not all of the indigenous Americans were in fact descended specifically from Laman and Lemuel? And that's a fair question. For many years, the Book of Mormon was promoted as the record of the ancient American people. But if you notice, now the church puts forth the Book of Mormon as a record of some of the early American people. And this is accurate. There were certainly other people here in the Americas when Lehi's family arrived. In fact, the greatest and most horrific battles of the Jaredites, who arrived 2,000 years before the Nephites and the Lamanites, which resulted in the deaths of millions, as Ether recounted it, were yet to happen when Lehi and Nephi landed upon the shores of these continents. And we know that the Nephites and the Mulekites, for example, lived simultaneously for hundreds of years before they discovered each other. That didn't happen until about 130 BC, and in Helaman 3, we read about a large number of Nephites who left to go northward into what we can assume was the land now part of the United States. It says, "And there were many who departed out of the land of Zarahemla, and went forth unto the land northward to inherit the land. And they did travel to an exceedingly great distance, insomuch that they came to large bodies of water and many rivers." Now, it's just my opinion, but this could very easily have been describing the Great Lakes and the Mississippi and Missouri and the Ohio rivers. Anyway, the next part is the interesting part. It says, "Yea, and even they did spread forth into all parts of the land, into whatsoever parts had not been rendered desolate and without timber," and listen to this, "because of the many inhabitants who had before inherited the land." So it stands to reason that if it was the Nephites who left and went forth, then it was other people, not Nephites, who had lived before on the land. One of the ideas I have heard that makes sense to me is the notion that the word Lamanite, when referring to people post-Book of Mormon, could be used as an adjective rather than as a noun, referring to all the indigenous people who remained after the great slaughter of the Nephites. And if you'll remember, the Lamanites were killing each other also once they had finished with the Nephites. So it is very possible that they could also have disappeared completely by the same process that removed the Nephites from this land. Also, the book of Ether tells us that the Jaredites were completely killed off except for one person, Coriantumr, who was found by the people of King Limhi. Still, their legacy would remain, and today scientists are discovering thousands, literally thousands of square miles of ancient ruins underneath the jungle canopies in Central America that will remain covered for many more years to come. There is just not enough money or research staff to dig it all up. So I can wait. I know the Book of Mormon story is true. I find comfort and support in other documents that have been uncovered, such as the Popol Vuh. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it clearly states that the ancestors of their people came from where the sun rises across the ocean. The Book of Mormon primarily recounts the history of two peoples, the Nephites and the Lamanites, who lived in almost constant religious and political conflict for centuries, the Book of Ether being the exception to all that. These groups began as the descendants of two Israelite brothers. Over time, the group known as the Lamanites grew to include others, such as some who, quote, had become Lamanites because of their dissensions from the Nephites. So too, the Mulekites became Nephites when they finally, after hundreds of years, encountered each other. Thus, the terms Nephite and Lamanite came to describe cultural and religious distinctions as well as ethnic differences or similarities. Eventually, Lamanites who did not believe the gospel of Jesus Christ overcame and destroyed the Nephite nation. Nephite prophets had foreseen this future destruction and prayed that their teachings, as preserved in the Book of Mormon, would one day be the means of converting the descendants of the Lamanites to the gospel. The Lord promised that in the latter days the Lamanites would come to the knowledge of their Redeemer, that they would participate in building the latter-day Zion as a part of God's covenant people, and that the powers of heaven would be in their midst. Revelation given through Joseph Smith confirmed that Book of Mormon promises about Lamanites remained in force. While some early Latter-day Saints speculated about which specific groups were the descendants of Book of Mormon people, most considered the Native Americans broadly as heirs to the Book of Mormon promises. I believe this perspective works on several levels. I'm reminded of the Lord's numerous statements that the people who were privileged to inhabit this land were expected to follow the Lord, at least in some reasonable way, and if not, they would be removed from the land. And this is why I think the original Lamanites were ultimately completely wiped out as well, though no one was around to document that event. But other people and other tribes did remain and filled the continents. It's estimated that at the time of the Revolutionary War, there were about 29 million indigenous people on the North American continent alone. And as such, they could represent the spirit of the Lamanites. And as possessors of the land, they would fall under the prophecies concerning those people that were to occur later when the Gentiles arrived. At the time the Book of Mormon was first published, European and European Americans had long claimed a tradition of descent from the 10 lost tribes of Israel spoken in the Bible. This helped them establish a connection between themselves and the covenant people of Israel. The Book of Mormon invited readers to consider yet other peoples, notably the native peoples of the Americas, the First Nation as we call them today, as lost sheep of the house of Israel, and part of this covenant history as well. I think this is further evidenced by the prophecies we read about in 1 Nephi 12 concerning the battles between the Nephites and the Lamanites and the eventual state of the Lamanites, and then followed that with chapter 13. And it says in verse 14, "It came to pass that I beheld many multitudes of the Gentiles upon the land of promise, and I beheld the wrath of God, that it was upon the seed of my brethren, and they were scattered before the Gentiles and were smitten." This is obviously speaking of Indians who were on this land when the white settlers arrived. In the times we are reading about in these sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph and all the brethren truly believed that the Indians were, in fact, the literal descendants of the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites, and as such were the ones they were directed to share this gospel with. It seems that they may have been in error in this. Nevertheless, I believe these were the people the Lord intended for the young missionaries to reach out to and to whom they were to preach. I think these Indians, these indigenous people, became inheritors of the promises of the Lord made to the Lamanites and to whomever would possess the land after them. And indeed, these early missionaries found within their lore and tradition deep spiritual foundations. Dr. Lynn Hilton Wilson, co-founder of Scripture Central, says there's good reasoning for using the word Lamanites to refer to all the indigenous people of the Americas. It is because this seems to have been a matter of vocabulary of the Book of Mormon. She claims the use of the word was not about geography nor genetics. She said, when the Lord said, you need to go preach among the Lamanites, the message was not one about the genetics nor the geography. It's been well over 3,000 years since the Jaredites arrived, and we know that they intermarried because some of the names and things like that in the Book of Mormon. 3,000 years of interbreeding and intermarriage has diluted and dispersed the Lamanite blood throughout the continent. Well, that sounds reasonable to me, and it is very possible that cultural threads and connections to past civilizations could have remained through the centuries up to our day. Have you ever heard of an Indian chieftain named Handsome Lake? He was a Seneca, religious leader of the Iroquois nation. He was born in 1735 in what is today Livingston County, New York. And he was a very interesting man. He was believed to be a prophet, and he preceded Joseph Smith by a few years. He died in 1816. But he had prophesied concerning his people, and in his records we find an account that sounds an awfully lot like a visit from the three Nephites. Let me share that with you. Handsome Lake had the visions that gave him power to become a prophet. In his vision, he was warned by three spiritual messengers who presented him with ideals that he must enforce among his people. They told him of the concerns he must enforce, like learning the English language and preservation of their land. Shortly after Handsome Lake's first vision, he ceased drinking alcohol. When he regained his health, he began bringing a message of Gaiawihio or Kaliwihio. I hope I didn't slaughter that too much, meaning the good word, to his people. He preached against drunkenness and other evil practices. His message outlined a moral code that was eventually referred to as the Code of Handsome Lake, and today it is called the Longhouse Religion. Handsome Lake abolished societal sins, attempting to cleanse the tribes of all immoral actions. He threatened his people in order to show them the error of their ways. He insisted that the Iroquois people must refrain from drinking, marital abuse, abortion, spouse and child abandonment, selling of land, overconsumption, intensive animal farming, I'm not quite sure what that was about, and witchcraft. The rise of Handsome Lake's way of life was more successful than most religions during that time because his code combined traditional Iroquois way of life with Quaker values. But despite the clear presence of Christian values in his teachings, it is unclear how much contact with Christianity Handsome Lake had previous to his visions. And Handsome Lake was not the only spiritual leader of indigenous tribes to receive and disseminate such messages. There are other similar reports in the historical record. I personally sat with the chief of the Hopi tribe of Keams Canyon, Arizona, many years ago, and he told me of heavenly visitors who came to them and foretold of the coming of missionaries who would show them the proper way. And as a result of that experience, almost all of the tribe of the Hopi Nation in Keams Canyon was converted to the church. In short, and to end this part, I believe that there was an identity that all indigenous people of this continent would and do share, the same way they are all grouped together as, quote, the first Americans or the First Nation. And because of that, they are, to my way of thinking, in a real sense, Lamanite people. Now, the Book of Mormon was published the same year the Indian Removal Act passed. It gave church members a different perspective on the past history and the future destiny of American Indians. And as I just said, the early saints believed that all the indigenous people were the descendants of the Book of Mormon people and that they shared a covenant heritage connecting them to ancient Israel. Latter-day Saints believed that Native Americans were heirs to God's promises, even though they now suffered for once having rejected the gospel. This belief instilled in the early saints a deeply felt obligation to bring the message of the Book of Mormon to them. Within months of founding the church in 1830, Latter-day Saint missionaries, directed by these sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, 30 through 37, as well as 28 for Oliver Cowdery, journeyed to Indian Territory on the borders of the United States west of Missouri. Parley P. Pratt reported that William Anderson, an Indian whose Indian name was Kiktawinund, the leader of a group of Delaware tribes who had been relocated to the area near Independence, Missouri, warmly received the missionaries, and an interpreter told Oliver Cowdery that, quote, the chief says he believes every word of the Book of Mormon. Sadly, government agents soon barred Oliver and his companions from any further evangelizing among Indians in the area because they had not, quote, secured proper authorization. There's always those permits by government officials. Oliver, Peter, and Parley spent time in Independence and did great missionary work there. One very interesting story comes from this period that I'd like to share. It turns out that Peter Whitmer Jr. was a fine tailor, and so he took employment to work as a tailor in Independence to help support his companions while they pressed on with their efforts to the Indians in the Indian Territories. From the autobiography of Mary E. Leitner, one of Peter's employees at his tailoring firm, we get this. I went to work for Peter Whitmer, who was a tailor by trade and just married. He was crowded with work. I think that just means it had a lot of work. And Lilburn W. Boggs offered him a room in his house, as he had just been elected lieutenant governor and wanted Peter to make him a suit for inauguration ceremonies. Peter did make the suit, and I stitched the collars and faced the coat. Mr. Boggs often came in to note the progress of the work. Now, you may recognize the name Lilburn W. Boggs because later he was elected governor of Missouri, and at that time he issued an extermination order calling for the removal of all the saints or their death. They were to be shot on sight if necessary. And you may remember from several weeks ago I related this account. Now, this happened a little later on, but still it was the same guy. On October 27, 1838, Lilburn W. Boggs, governor of the state of Missouri now, issued Missouri Executive Order 44, which said the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description. General Samuel D. Lucas, leading a militia of 2,500 men, informed the Mormons at Far West that they would massacre every man, woman, and child if Smith and several others were not given up. Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Parley P. Pratt, Lyman White, and George W. Robinson surrendered on November 1st. A secret and illegal court-martial was held following Smith's surrender. Smith and his companions were not aware of the proceeding until after it was over. At about midnight on November 1st, General Lucas issued the following order to General Alexander William Donovan. Sir, you will take Joseph Smith and the other prisoners into the public square at Far West and shoot them at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. General Donovan refused to obey the order. It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. My brigade shall march for Liberty Township tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God. Now, interestingly, this same wonderful General Alexander Donovan was also one of Peter Whitmer's clients there in Independence at the same time as Lilburn W. Boggs. So we see that Peter Whitmer was connected to both of these powerful men years earlier. The one who later tried to destroy the saints and the one who stepped in defiantly to protect them from that order. After his mission, Peter returned to Independence and remained true and faithful to the gospel until his untimely and unfortunate death in 1836. So, getting back to the Lamanites. Amid these troubles in Missouri during the 1830s, the church leaders were cautious about contact with local native groups, having been accused by their enemies of using missionary work to cultivate sedition among the Indians. So you can see how the persecution started going, feeling justified in their concerns. Nevertheless, during the 1840s, Joseph Smith and the First Presidency sent missionaries to the Sioux in Dakota, the Potawatomi, the Stockbridge or Mohican, and other Indian peoples residing in Wisconsin and Canada. Delegations from the Sauk and Fox tribes met in Nauvoo with Joseph Smith, who told them of the Book of Mormon and plans to raise up a new Jerusalem. 2 years later, Potawatomi leaders asked Joseph and the Latter-day Saints to lend aid and join an alliance of confederated tribes. Joseph declined that offer, but assured them that the Book of Mormon could light the way toward peaceful relationships. The record says the church had great success, first preaching among the Seneca Nation near Buffalo, New York, and later, joined by others, they found great success in and around Kirtland, Ohio. There, Parley Pratt met with his old preaching partner in the Campbellite church, Sidney Rigdon, who was converted very quickly. In all, they baptized almost 130 members of that congregation, earning them the eternal ire of Alexander Campbell, who later wrote a disparaging book called Delusions. One statistic I found amazing was that they were able to baptize people beginning with the very first day they taught. I guess we're used to missionary lessons and the conversion process taking several weeks, but for these gentlemen, they did not have the complex structure of the church and all its teachings. They had faith in the restoration and in the Book of Mormon, and that is what they took to the people. Many were converted and baptized the same day. Parley had been baptized only a month earlier, and Ziba Peterson had been baptized by Parley just a few weeks after that. These were young men armed with faith in the Book of Mormon, which they were studying voraciously in order to have something to teach the Indians. I've always had a special place in my heart for Parley P. Pratt, whose book, The Autobiography of Parley Pratt, greatly affected me in my life and my missionary work. But the faith of all of these men was to be admired, and their efforts were rewarded handsomely. Of his own conversion and his feelings about the Book of Mormon, Parley wrote, "I opened it with eagerness and read its title page. I then read the testimony of the several witnesses in relation to the manner of its being found and translated. After this, I commenced its contents by course. I read all day, for I preferred reading to sleep. Eating was a burden. I had no desire for food. Sleep was a burden when the night came, for I preferred reading to sleep. As I read, the Spirit of the Lord was upon me, and I knew and comprehended that the book was true as plainly and manifestly as a man comprehends and knows that he exists. My joy was now full, as it were, and I rejoiced sufficiently to more than pay me for all the sorrows, sacrifices, and tolls of my life." And Casey Paul Griffith records this: "During his lifetime, Parley Pratt was instrumental in helping convert a number of important figures, including Sidney Rigdon, Edward Partridge, and future church president John Taylor. He was ordained a member of this dispensation's original Quorum of the 12 Apostles in 1835. He also authored Voice of Warning in 1837 and Key to the Science of Technology in 1855, two of the most important missionary and theological texts of the early church. He suffered a martyr's death when he was murdered in 1857, and according to one observer, his final words were, "I die a firm believer in the gospel of Jesus Christ, as revealed through the prophet Joseph Smith, and I wish you to carry this, my dying testimony. I know that the gospel is true and that Joseph Smith was a prophet of the living God. I am dying a martyr to the faith." Well, despite intermittent conflict, church leaders remained committed to bringing the message of the Book of Mormon to the Native Americans, and they established proselyting missions and farms. These efforts introduced the gospel and provided education and food for Indians in Utah and Arizona. Missionaries during the second half of the 19th century visited Catawba, Goshute, Hopi, Maricopa, Navajo, Papago, Pima, Shoshone, Ute, and Zuni peoples, forced by settler expansion to live on Indian reservations scattered throughout the America West. Thousands of northwestern Shoshones in the 1870s, that'd be up in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, were baptized and eventually formed Washakie Ward, which was led by the first American Indian bishop in the church, Moroni Timbimbu. Rather than move to reservations, many Utes from central Utah settled in Indianola in San Pete County, where they built up a vibrant branch and a relief society with an Indian woman serving in the presidency. Over 1,200 Papago, Pima, and Maricopa Indians in southern Arizona joined the church in the 1800s, establishing a ward that later contributed to the building and dedication of the Mesa, Arizona Temple. In South Carolina, most of the Catawba Nation received a baptism. About 65 years later, Catawba Chief Samuel Taylor Blue spoke in General Conference. And he said, "I have tasted the blessings and joy of God. I have seen the dead raised. I have seen the sick, whom the doctors have given up on. Through the administration of the elders, they have been restored to life. My brothers and sisters, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this gospel is true." Latter-day Saint outreach to American Indians continued into the 1930s and 1940s with the expansion of missions in Arizona and New Mexico. These missions alerted church leaders to adverse conditions on the Southwest Indian reservations, and they began to consider alternatives to direct proselyting, feeling, as Spencer W. Kimball later expressed, an obligation to help their covenant siblings. In the 1950s, a student placement program emerged in which Latter-day Saint families hosted Indian students during school semesters. In addition, Brigham Young University offered scholarships with the goal of increasing American Indian enrollment. By the time the Indian student placement program came to a close around the year 2000, some 50,000 American Indian students had been sponsored. Apparently today the church's position is this. When asked about the church's official position on this matter by a writer, a church spokesman said, "As to whether these were the first inhabitants, we don't have a position on that. Our scripture does not try to account for any other people who may have lived in the New World before, during, or after the days of the Jaredites and the Nephites, and we don't have any official doctrine about who the descendants of the Nephites and the Jaredites are." Many Mormons believe that American Indians are descendants of the Lamanites, a division of the Nephites, but that's not in the scripture. And then he makes this note. This is a reply that predates any publication of DNA criticism of the Lamanite issue. And we get this from LDS.org. Just as the history of the northern 10 tribes of Israel after their exile in Assyria was a matter of speculation rather than knowledge, the history of the Lamanites after the close of the Book of Mormon record is a matter of speculation. The church asserts that all members are part of the covenant house of Israel, either by descent or adoption, but does not take a position on the specific geography of the Book of Mormon or claim complete knowledge about the origins of any specific modern group in the Americas or the Pacific. Whatever the historical particulars, the church continues its efforts to help realize the hopes of Book of Mormon prophets that the covenants of the Lord might be extended to all the lost sheep of Israel. Now, I know we spent a lot of time on this subject, but I hope it has given you some perspective on the nature of this issue of the Lamanites and the church today, and why these sections of the Doctrine and Covenants were so important and so focused on the Lamanites. I guess we got sidetracked a little bit, but this is such an interesting history, I just couldn't breeze right past it. However, one person that I have neglected so far is Thomas B. Marsh, the subject of section 31, and I'd like to take just a few minutes more of your time to tell you something about him. He was an amazing man, and his story is one worth repeating. However, there's much too much of that for today, so let me just say, most of you have probably heard of Thomas B. Marsh and the story of the milk and the amount of cream that was on the top of the milk that led to a great disagreement between him and the prophet. That disagreement led to his separation from the church for a number of years. And it is too bad that that is all most of us know, because he was a remarkable man and servant of the Lord. And in fact, I will be doing a podcast about him soon. I'm working on a series called Great Men of the Early Church, and it will focus on the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses and people such as Sidney Rigdon and Parley P. Pratt and, yes, Thomas B. Marsh. Many of these men left the church and then subsequently came back. Some did not, but they were all extraordinary men who did extraordinary works for the Lord. But since section 31 is directed specifically towards Thomas B. Marsh, let me give you this little bit. He was from Clarkston, Massachusetts, and was a member of the Methodist Church there. He heard about the Book of Mormon in 1839 before it was published, and this is what led him to that. He says, "I thought the Spirit required me to make a journey west." For him, west was Palmyra, where he went and first heard about the printing of the Book of Mormon. He met Martin Harris, who showed him some proof sheets of the forthcoming book. The record says he also met Oliver Cowdery, who, he says, gave me all the information concerning the book I wanted. I can only imagine the story Oliver was able to share with him. Anyway, he says he traveled back home with a proof sheet that contained the first 16 pages of the new book. As soon as the Book of Mormon was published, Thomas moved with his family to Palmyra and was baptized by David Whitmer and ordained an elder by Oliver Cowdery. Now, Joseph Smith received the revelation of section 31 on September 26, 1830. It was the last revelation of that day. And it says in part, "Thomas, my son, blessed are you because of your faith in my work. Behold, you have had many afflictions because of your family. Nevertheless, I will bless you and your family, yea, your little ones, and the day cometh that they will believe and know the truth and be with you in my church. Lift up your heart and rejoice, for the hour of your mission is come, and your tongue shall be loosed, and you shall declare glad tidings of great joy unto this generation." Now realize that Thomas was baptized and ordained an elder and called on a mission only very soon thereafter. But he did become a great missionary for the church, and he was eventually, in 1835, called to serve as the first president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in this dispensation. Hiram Smith and someone else named Yana Sojal noted this: "As long as Thomas B. Marsh was faithful, he was an eloquent speaker. At the time of the troubles in Clay County, Missouri, he was elected member of a committee to lay the grievances of the saints before the authorities of the state. On that occasion, he spoke so impressively that General Atchison, one of the saints' worst enemies who was present, shed tears, and the meeting passed resolutions to assist the saints in finding a new location." Sadly, a disagreement over the disbursement of a portion of cream with the milk he was given was the source of a conflict that would see Thomas leave the church, and that is about all most of us know about him. But he did come back, and that is a wonderful story. But you're just going to have to wait until I can get to that. By the way, for that series, I will have some guests with me to share with you the great stories of these amazing men. But I think this is enough for today, so I'm going to leave you until next week. I hope you all have a great week. I have a very busy week. I'm going to be spending the whole week in a training facility with aircraft simulators, having all kinds of emergencies and events to deal with. So I'll be busy, but I will still get another podcast ready for you next Sunday. It'll be a special lesson about Easter, and I hope you'll join me then. So, until then, have a great week. I'm Mark Swint. Thank you for listening.